Hi, everybody. Welcome back to the third and final part of My Father's Shade. Thanks for listening and watching, and we'll start where we left off. We walked over to the White House and looked through the iron fence and up the long, sloping lawn. Carl swore he saw the president in an upstairs window. We walked down to the World War II memorial, and Carl moved in circles around the pillars. At the base of the Washington Monument, I took pictures and toyed with perspective. Carl holding the tip of the monument, Carl pushing it over or supporting its weight. We read plaques and talked to some veterans at the Vietnam War wall. I bought hot dogs and Cokes from a sidewalk vendor, and for a time we sat on the grass and watched tourists flow back and forth, a regular father and son enjoying a regular day. As we headed back to the car, a tandem of fighter jets buzzed high over the city, vapor trails fanning out behind them and growing thinner. From our angle, it seemed as if they were blasting right off into space, the lines reaching far up and out, everything moving fast, escaping, leaping into unfathomably thin air. The sky was darkening and the jet trails split the colors. The earthly side shimmered in afternoon blue, but further out, where I could imagine the misty, curling haze of the upper atmosphere, a strange shade of pink blossomed as if from some unidentified spectrum, a new universe. I had my arm around Carl's shoulder. I could have lifted off into the air if he'd not been there. "What's with the jets?" Carl said. "Protection, I suppose." "From what?" "Bombs, other airplanes." "They scare me," he said, as he scanned the sky for things against which he'd need protection. He tilted his head to the side as if to better hear the harsh whistle of the security alarms. The jets disturbed the tenor of the day, reminding me that Carl was still young, still afraid of much. He was most likely still afraid that I'd revert to the man whom he'd found passed out in the bathtub or on the front lawn, a man who'd vanished for days. Once he sat with me for 2 hours when I was dead drunk, just to make sure I was breathing. I'd never be able to return those innocent years I'd stolen, and felt a twinge of panic that if I were to die, those drunken moments might be what Carl would best remember of his father. After the jets were gone and the sound dissipated, people stopped staring into the sky, the idea of terror fleeting in the midst of such a day. A group of teens resumed tossing the football, and hundreds of people moved about us, free from worry. Carl and I stayed close on the way back to the car, as if together we were battling a strong wind. On the way south, I banked hard as we headed out of the city and enjoyed the familiar pull toward the passenger side of the car. Carl leaned against the door, and even though it had been years since I sat in his position, I could feel the pressure of the door handle in my side. Once, just outside city limits, I saw a brown van on the side of the road and hoped that it was from the Department of Corrections and that we'd see prisoners in their jumpsuits cleaning the littered shoulder. But the van was abandoned, an orange impound sticker on the driver's side window. Carl closed his eyes. Instead of driving to my apartment for a night spent looking out over the dark roof of the strip mall, I went to Lakeview, where the lights were always on. It was the first time Carl had been to Annie's new home, and she made us plates of leftover lasagna and fussed over my sleepy-eyed son. My mother and Frank Bees were visiting, watching a baseball game with Bert. The house retained the barrenness that accompanies newer homes long after the owners distribute their belongings. Recessed lighting illuminated bare walls and hardwood floors. Our voices reverberated in the cavernous space, echoed across the empty shelves and still blank alcoves. After we'd eaten, Annie cleared our plates and brought a fresh beer to Bert. Carl stood up and went out into the backyard with his cousins. As much as I wanted to see a reflection of young Annie in their faces, I could not. They could have been any two unrelated children. The whole house seemed a foreign country, the people unknown, the language peculiar, and the customs baffling. The night sky had turned bright, the moon full above the pond, one of those hallucinatory moons that seem too large for the sky, as if it were falling suddenly to earth. An empty beer bottle sat on the porch railing. I didn't think about drinking, and I didn't think about not drinking. Once I have that battle, I've already lost. I wanted a cigarette badly. I sipped my Coke and watched the kids down near the edge of the pond. They tossed rocks into the water, the ripples roiling across the reflection of the moon. On the other shore, a man walked down from his house and lit the tiki torches. He sat on the edge of his dock, feet dangling. Annie pulled on my sleeve, and we went around to the corner of the house to smoke. She took a few drags and handed it to me before putting gum in her mouth. Why don't you just tell Bert you smoke? I don't smoke. You bought the cigarettes. What's going on with you? How do you mean? I said. You don't normally show up without calling. Breaking into your family time? I'm sorry. We smoked a while longer, ashes falling down into the damp grass. It's not that, Annie said. She puffed out her lower lip, another of our mother's physical expressions, this one of doubt or worry that Annie had inherited. Watching her, the underside of her lip exposed, I understood what was bothering her. She didn't want to share our mother. You remember sneaking out at night? I said. I never snuck out. Like you don't smoke. I never snuck out. She brushed back some hair and chewed on her lip. Bert slid open the screen door and called for Annie, but she didn't respond. The kids tossed something heavy into the water. A neighbor's radio was playing an old Steely Dan song. My throat was scratchy and dry, like I was getting a cold. I took the pack of cigarettes and lit another. Annie held out her hand impatiently. Bert went back inside. After Dad died, I said, you sneaked out. We both did. We'd wait until the late train came by and go out the kitchen door when the whistle started blowing. Sure, Annie said. I wasn't thinking of that. We walked further around the side of the yard and down through the front. The street lights dotted the street with elegant little pools of whiteness. The moon's intensity was diminished. Each driveway rose from street level, a wave of paving stones and neatly manicured and mulched gardens. I didn't like sneaking out, Annie said. I did it for you, so you could drink your beer. Mom was always awake. That's what I remember most. Her staying up and watching Tom Snyder or some old movie. I just remember sneaking out and drinking Black Label by the tracks. Gross, Annie said. I hated that stuff. I hate these cigarettes, too. She watched her house and chewed 2 more pieces of gum. Once, she said, I got up in the night to pee, and she was standing in the front room looking out the front window like she did the night he disappeared. Like she was still waiting. Like he was just a bit late. It was futile, I said. Easy for you to say. In the white light of the street light, Annie's face belied her claim that she didn't smoke. Her cheeks were gaunt and tight as someone who smoked a pack a day. The sheen of her makeup gave her a translucent glow, and I had the fleeting sensation that my sister was hollow, cored out, broken by her love and devotion to my mother. She bit her lower lip and chewed her memories. I better get back in, she said. Of course, I said. I'm sorry. Nothing to be sorry about, she said. You didn't do anything. She reached out and put her hands on my shoulder, and her touch was light, flittering, like a spider crawling over my shirt. She opened her mouth to say something else, but closed it before the words formed. The wind pulled her hair in a dozen different directions at once, and for a moment she was an ethereal presence, something connected to the unknowable, to the mystic, and then she was grounded again, a daughter, mother, wife, and sister. She left me there and walked quickly back through the yard and into the house. I could hear her calling to my mother, asking if she wanted a cup of tea, asking if she needed anything at all, remaining the protective, buoyant force she was in the days and months just after my father died, although it was clear my mother no longer needed my sister's ministrations, relying as she did on Frank B's, as she had for many years, in ways all but invisible to her children. After I called Carl back from the water, I went to the family room to say goodbye. Bert was wrapped up in the game, beer in hand, shaking his head and muttering about some player's ineptitude. Frank reached out to shake my hand, solid as always. aware that he was a placeholder for me, but loving me anyway. My mother and sister sat at a table away from the television, looking through some home furnishing catalogs, fingers paging through pictures of curtains and vases, armoires and light fixtures. I moved behind them and my mother looked up at me. She shrugged a bit, as she always did, and returned her attention to Annie. Annie looked at me as if she'd not seen me in some time, already absorbed with the living apparition of my mother. My father died needlessly while trying to help people he didn't know. He'd been coming home from work late on a rainy night, avoiding the highway and taking a roundabout route. He came upon a group of cars stopped in the middle of the road. Up ahead, the Schuster Creek had become suddenly engorged. Witnesses said it was like a dam broke. The water came from nowhere and washed up over the small bridge. A sedan had been caught in the rush and lifted away from the asphalt. It was lodged between a telephone pole and some rocks. A family remained trapped inside. They'd opened their windows and were trying to escape. The woman in the passenger seat held a small boy. My father, perhaps feeling that he was close enough and strong enough to help, walked through the rushing water to the car without much difficulty. The woman handed her son to him through the window. The boy was 3 years old. The woman was 22. My father carried the boy to the edge of the bridge, where the safety rail was still visible atop the rising water. The woman squirmed into the water and followed my father. Once the mother and the boy were safely pressed against the railing, my father went back to help the driver. That, apparently, is when he was swept away. They found his body downstream about a mile, battered and drowned, without his shoes or his glasses. The flood waters receded within minutes, vanishing as quickly as they came. The family survived. On the front page of the Post, the headline read, "Local man dies, saving boy." There was a photo of the ruined car balanced on some rocks. The road was mostly washed away. The accompanying photo of my father was a grainy old army photo. In the newsprint, he was blanched and ghostly. Thank you. Another story starting tomorrow. Thanks a lot.